By the middle of the 19th century, it was increasingly clear that the formerly voiceless classes, the working classes, were gaining a voice. The emergence of mass politics, a political order in which mass political parties proliferate and common people begin to feel a loyalty to their party and their government, changed the political game in Europe. Realpolitik was not just about international goals, but also about domestic ones. Moreover, those who felt ignored by their governments were much more likely to organize and demonstrate. In a very real sense, the birth of mass politics in the late 19th century sees the birth of the modern world. Unlike other European states, France, or at least parts of France, had experienced brief periods of mass politics before, especially during the French Revolution. But the rise of both Napoleons had ended that political discourse, so it wasn't until after the end of France's Second Empire, that is, until after France's defeat during the Franco-Prussian War, that mass politics again held sway in France. Despite superior French firearms, including the newly invented machine gun, the Prussian army had reached Paris by the beginning of September of 1870. At first, the Parisians rejoiced. Napoleon III was gone. They proclaimed a republic in France and established a provisional government. Napoleon III, ill and newly captured, would spend months in a German prison before being freed. He'd end up spending the last 2 years of his life in exile in England before dying during surgery in 1873. However, despite that joyous feeling in Paris, the French military had not yet ceded the war. The number of soldiers and National Guardsmen in Paris increased, but to no avail. As the siege of Paris intensified, hunger set in. Parisians sought food wherever they could. Family pets were sacrificed, as were the animals in the famous Paris Zoo. The nominal head of France's acting government, Adolphe Thiers, was in communication with Bismarck. Thiers wanted Bismarck's support in the establishment of either a conservative French republic or the return of the French monarchy. Bismarck indicated that Prussia would be in favor of either choice as long as the government was conservative. On the 28th of January of 1871, nearly 5 months into the siege of Paris and 10 days after Wilhelm was crowned Kaiser of the German Empire, Bismarck and Thiers signed an armistice. In the agreement, France lost Alsace and much of Lorraine, 2 territories in the northeast, to the German Empire. There was, however, disagreement over the armistice, and some French leaders demanded that French forces continue fighting. An election was held in early February for the new National Assembly. This new body formally elected Thiers as the chief executive of the provisional government, essentially ratifying the armistice. So, the war was over. In mid-March of 1871, Thiers sent a small detachment of troops to collect the cannon that the National Guard had used to protect Paris during the siege. Parisians were resentful of the armistice. Fighting during the Franco-Prussian War had largely focused around Paris, and Parisians were angry that the rest of France hadn't really been as affected as they had been. Moreover, the sight of armed French soldiers in Paris ignited old working-class cynicism. Parisians remembered that Thiers had been an advisor to King Louis-Philippe, and that Thiers had suggested that Louis-Philippe sent troops to Paris to quell worker and pro-Republican demonstrations way back in February of 1848. Thiers was not a popular figure in Paris. And so, Parisian citizens, aided by prisoners of war recently released by Bismarck's troops, prepared to defend their city, this time against their fellow French citizens. Parisians built barricades which prevented the National Guard from entering their city. Parisian socialists placed posters around the capital calling for the establishment of a new government in Paris. Now, seemingly at odds with the rest of France, the Paris Commune, the new government of the city of Paris, called for the Parisian secession from France and set about planning the defense of its city. Revolutionary fervor of a kind not seen since the 1790s took hold in Paris. The mix included Jacobins, true socialists, liberal Republicans, and even anarchists. The Parisian communards enacted significant social reforms in their city. Historically, the most important of them dealt with women's rights. Women's unions were recognized, and the city established nurseries for working mothers. They also set about establishing laws which regulated working conditions and fair pay. Other large French cities saw demonstrations from pro-communard groups as well. This threatened to become a countrywide problem. However, the vast majority of the country disapproved of the Paris Commune, and Thiers was granted the authority to send soldiers to aid the National Guard in its attempts to retake Paris. On the 21st of May, 1871, French troops broke through the barricades and poured into the city. During the bloody week that followed, Thiers' army fought street by street to retake Paris. They executed the communard leaders they found. While the communards put up a resistance, including the execution of their own hostages, and that included an Archbishop of Paris, in the end, the Paris Commune fell to the French army. At least 25,000 Parisians died at the hands of that army. Paris would be brought to heel by Thiers' government. To conservatives, the Commune offered a frightening look at the consequences of communism. Most specifically, this gave a terrifying look at what happened when men allowed women a voice in government. The concept of woman incendiary, a woman so caught up in her power over others that she burned down the city around her, was such a dramatic view of what had happened with the Paris Commune that women's rights were once again subsumed in the aftermath. Provisional government gave way officially to France's Third Republic. This government would be a hotly contested political institution from its very beginning until its collapse in 1940. Pushed by the press, intrigue and scandal threatened popular politics in France, where, in theory, universal male suffrage already existed, but where the effective participation of the male electorate was still not secured, and of course, where women were still denied a voice entirely. In 1875, a new constitution created a ceremonial presidency and a premiership, like a prime minister, dependent on support from an elected legislature made up of the Chamber of Deputies and a Senate. An alliance of businessmen, shopkeepers, white-collar professionals, and rural property owners hoped that the new system would prevent the kind of strong-arm politics that had ended previous republics. However, compromises were menaced by a highly partisan press, which, again in theory, represented the voices of the French people. This partisanship kept the Third Republic on shaky ground as it navigated destabilizing economic downturns, corruption, and growing anti-Semitism. Support for the government was rocked by stories about the members of the Chamber of Deputies selling their votes to business interests, and some publications contributed to that unrest by scapegoating, linking economic swings to the alleged machinations of Jewish businessmen in particular. As a result, general public sentiment turned against the Jews for the failures of Republican government and the economy. Republican leaders tried to reassure citizens by fortifying civic institutions, especially by instituting compulsory and free public education in the 1880s. In these public schools, secular Republican-minded teachers supplanted the Catholic clergy, France's traditional teaching class, who often favored a return to monarchy. And a new centralized curriculum featured patriotic primers and courses in French geography, literature, and history. The government even instituted secular public high schools for young women, who were seen as the primary educators of future citizens. Mandatory military service for men further established values of national identity and pride in place of traditional regional and rural identities. The goal was to turn peasants into Frenchmen, and it worked. From the foundation of the Third Republic through the Belle Époque at the end of the century, numerous political parties vied for power in France. This is the very definition of mass politics. In the early years of the Third Republic, the various monarchist groups were the most powerful, but they disagreed about a presidential candidate. The global economic recession, which hit in 1873 and didn't end until 1879, it's called the Long Depression, affected the viability of monarchist presidents, which allowed the moderates and Republicans to take control. However, as the working classes grew increasingly restive, the various socialist groups developed their own political parties, including the French Workers' Party, co-founded by Karl Marx's son-in-law, and the Possibilists, who had come to believe in the gradual movement toward socialism because a workers' revolution was not a popular idea across France. As France barreled toward the 20th century, the only thing that was settled was how unsettled France's political situation really was. As we will see very soon, despite the fact that the Third Republic made it to the year 1900, its continued viability remained largely uncertain.